You might think food is just about flavor, but the truth is, it's always been about memory. Every casserole, every pie, every pudding once carried the weight of comfort, survival, and celebration. Forgotten recipes aren't just quirky old dishes, they're echoes of the kitchens that raised America. Families passed them around church halls, clipped them from worn-out magazines, or scratched them onto recipe cards now stained with butter and thyme. Back then, food didn't need to be flashy. It just needed to work. A handful of flour, a splash of vinegar, a can of soup, ingredients that might seem strange to us today, but in their time, they were lifelines. They stretched budgets, filled bellies, and more importantly, they created moments. A child sneaking a spoonful of pudding before dinner. A father coming home from work to the smell of something sweet bubbling in the oven. A grandmother proudly serving her mock pie that fooled everyone at the table. What's wild is how quickly some of these dishes vanished. As tastes evolved and convenience foods changed the landscape, many of these recipes faded into the background, tucked away in forgotten cookbooks. But behind each one lies a story, a snapshot of how Americans lived, adapted, and celebrated in different eras. So in this series, we're digging back through the cupboards of the past. From salads made with marshmallows and whipped cream, to cakes born from scarcity, to pies that weren't quite what they claimed to be, these recipes tell a bigger story about resilience, creativity, and the joy of making something out of almost nothing. Stick around, because what's coming next might just surprise you. Imagine opening the fridge in the 1950s and finding a dish that shimmered like a jewel. That was seafoam dessert salad, a pastel cloud of sweetness that felt equal parts science experiment and celebration. It wasn't really a salad in the leafy sense, but in mid-century America, salad often meant a colorful concoction of canned fruit, whipped cream, and gelatin that appeared on holiday tables and potluck spreads. The magic of seafoam salad came from its texture. Whipped cream was folded into lime or lemon jello, then blended with crushed pineapple and sometimes cream cheese. The result was airy, foamy, and almost otherworldly. Set in a ring mold or glass bowl, it looked like something straight out of a magazine and promising the future of food. Housewives loved it because it was inexpensive, easy to prepare, and most importantly, it looked impressive. Cultural context is what made this dish shine. Post-war America was fascinated with convenience and modernity. Packaged foods, gelatin powders, and canned fruits were symbols of progress. Serving a dish like seafoam salad wasn't just about taste, it was about showing that your kitchen was modern, efficient, and with the times. Children adored its sweetness, adults admired its presentation, and everyone agreed it brightened the table. But like many gelatin desserts, it didn't survive changing tastes. By the 1980s, people leaned toward fresher, less processed foods. What once felt futuristic began to feel artificial, and seafoam salad slowly disappeared from gatherings. Still, for those who remember it, this dessert carries a deep nostalgia, the memory of family gatherings, pastel Pyrex bowls, and a world where even a simple Jell-O dish could feel magical. Because sometimes, sweetness wasn't just in the flavor. It was in the moment. There was a time when dessert wasn't always about sugar overload, it was about sophistication. And few forgotten recipes captured that balance quite like coffee jelly. Imagine a dessert that looked elegant in its glass dish, sparkled in cubes, and carried the rich aroma of morning coffee. It was light, refined, and surprisingly common on American tables throughout the early and mid-20th century. The recipe was simple: brewed coffee, sugar, and unflavored gelatin set into a jiggling mold, then topped with whipped cream or sweetened condensed milk. But the simplicity was deceptive. This dish carried cultural weight. In an era when coffee breaks defined office culture and after-dinner coffee was a sign of good hospitality, transforming coffee into dessert felt modern and clever. It was the kind of treat you'd serve at luncheons, church gatherings, or even after a Sunday roast. What made coffee jelly special was its balance. It wasn't heavy like cake, nor overly sweet like pudding. Instead, it was refreshing, a cool, bittersweet end to a hearty meal. Housewives loved that it was affordable and adaptable, and it fit right into the gelatin craze of the 1920s and 1950s, when mold desserts were the pride of the table. But as dessert trends shifted, coffee jelly lost its spotlight. American palates craved richer indulgences, chocolate cakes, creamy pies, and ice cream sundaes. A wobbly cube of coffee no longer felt indulgent enough. By the late 20th century, it quietly vanished from most cookbooks, remembered only in fragments. Still, coffee jelly has never truly disappeared. It lingers in memories of grandparents' tables and in vintage recipe cards stained with coffee rings. For those who tasted it, it wasn't just a dessert, it was proof that elegance didn't have to be complicated. Sometimes, a simple wobble could carry the flavor of an entire era. Delicate, frothy, and as light as air, snow pudding was the kind of dessert that made its mark not by richness, but by elegance. Long before fancy mousses or soufflés reached American kitchens, this old-fashioned treat brought a touch of refinement to the table. It was often saved for special occasions, a dessert that looked simple at first glance but carried a quiet charm. The recipe called for lemon juice, sugar, water, and unflavored gelatin, whipped into a froth that set into a cloud-like texture. Served cold, it was often paired with a custard sauce or sometimes fresh fruit. What gave snow pudding its beauty wasn't just the taste, but the texture. It melted on the tongue, refreshing and citrusy, almost like tasting winter itself. This dessert thrived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when lighter, more delicate foods were prized in genteel households. In an era where heavy pies and rich puddings dominated the average table, snow pudding stood out as something refined, something you might serve when guests were expected, or when you wanted to show a bit of flair without expensive ingredients. It was also practical. Lemons and sugar were inexpensive, and gelatin was becoming more accessible thanks to commercial packaging. Housewives could whip up snow pudding with little cost, yet still present something that felt special. Children loved its cloud-like softness, while adults appreciated the gentle tang after a heavy meal. But as decades rolled on, it faded from memory. Richer desserts captured the American imagination, and snow pudding, delicate and subtle, felt too modest. Yet for those who remember it, this dish wasn't just a dessert. It was a reminder that sometimes the lightest, simplest creations can leave the deepest impression. Snow pudding was proof that elegance could be born from almost nothing. Once upon a time, the word junket didn't mean a vacation or a trip, it meant dessert. Junket custard was a dish that carried centuries of tradition, arriving in America with European settlers and finding its way onto countless kitchen tables. Simple, gentle, and nourishing, it was a dessert that spoke more to comfort than extravagance. At its heart, junket custard was made from milk, sugar, and a special ingredient called rennet, an enzyme traditionally used in cheesemaking. When added to warm milk, the rennet caused it to set into a delicate custard, soft and slightly wobbly, with a flavor that was mild and creamy. Sometimes vanilla or nutmeg was added for a touch of warmth, but its strength lay in its simplicity. This dessert was especially beloved in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when lighter, milk-based foods were considered ideal for children, the sick, and the elderly. Doctors even recommended it as an easily digestible treat, making it as much a health food as it was a sweet. Families saw it as a gentle comfort, something both soothing and satisfying, especially in homes where resources were limited and nothing could go to waste. Culturally, junket custard was tied to a slower way of living. It didn't shout for attention, it whispered of homeliness, care, and tradition. Mothers would stir it gently on the stove, children would wait impatiently for it to cool, and grandmothers would recall it from their own youth. But as times changed, so did appetites. Gelatin desserts, instant puddings, and packaged sweets replaced it. The idea of buying rennet tablets just to make custard felt old-fashioned. And so, junket custard quietly disappeared from the mainstream. Still, for those who remember, it remains more than food. It's a taste of gentleness, a dessert built on care. Sometimes the best desserts are the ones that feel almost accidental, and chocolate haystacks, also known as chow mein cookies, were exactly that kind of happy surprise. Unlike elegant puddings or mulled salads, this was a treat born out of convenience, creativity, and a touch of mid-century kitchen fun. The recipe couldn't have been simpler. Crunchy chow mein noodles, yes, the kind, were mixed with melted chocolate, sometimes butterscotch chips, and occasionally peanuts or marshmallows. The mixture was then dropped onto wax paper in little clusters that resembled messy haystacks. They didn't need baking, just a bit of time to harden, and suddenly you had a dessert that was crunchy, sweet, and ready to share. Chocolate haystacks fit perfectly into the spirit of the 1950s and 60s, when home cooks embraced quick, no-bake recipes that still felt inventive. They showed up at bake sales, church socials, and kids' birthday parties. Parents loved them because they were inexpensive and practically foolproof, while kids adored them because they tasted like candy with a satisfying crunch. What made these cookies truly special was their personality. They weren't polished or perfect, they were playful. A plate of haystacks on the counter suggested spontaneity, as if someone had whipped them up on a whim. They carried the flavor of home, not a bakery, and that made them even more beloved. But like many retro treats, their popularity faded as newer, trendier desserts took the spotlight. Today, they're often remembered with a laugh. Remember those cookies made with chow mein noodles? Yet for those who grew up with them, the memory is sweet and vivid, sticky fingers, chocolate smudges, and the joy of something that felt homemade and fun. Chocolate haystacks prove that sometimes, the simplest mashups leave the biggest mark. Some desserts are all about drama, and self-saucing butterscotch pudding cake was one of those magical recipes that never failed to impress. At first glance, it looked like a simple golden cake baked in a casserole dish. But the moment you slid a spoon inside, a warm, velvety river of butterscotch sauce came pouring out from beneath. It was half cake, half pudding, and entirely unforgettable. The magic came from its clever method. A batter of brown sugar, butter, and flour was spread into a pan, then topped with a sugary mixture of boiling water poured right over the top. As it baked, the cake rose while the liquid sank, transforming into a rich sauce that pooled at the bottom. To a child watching, it felt like kitchen alchemy. To adults, it was pure comfort, sweet, sticky, and cozy. This dessert became popular in the mid-20th century, when resourceful home bakers loved recipes that delivered more than meets the eye. It didn't require expensive ingredients, yet it felt indulgent enough for Sunday dinners or holiday gatherings. The flavor of butterscotch, warm caramel notes with a hint of butter and brown sugar, was familiar and nostalgic, reminding people of candy shops and old-fashioned sweets. Families adore the ritual of scooping out servings, each portion topped with a drizzle of its own sauce. Add a scoop of ice cream or whipped cream, and you had a dessert that stretched across generations, pleasing both children and grandparents alike. But over time, it faded into the background. Convenience puddings and instant cake mixes replaced it, and the patient art of baking from scratch slipped away. Still, for those who remember, this dish wasn't just dessert, it was a little kitchen miracle. Because sometimes, the sweetest things are the ones that surprise you. There's something almost magical about a dessert that looks plain but hides a secret sweetness. Brown sugar dumplings were exactly that kind of dish, simple balls of dough simmered in a bubbling syrup until they became tender, golden, and irresistibly sweet. To families who grew up with them, they weren't just dessert, they were comfort in its purest form. The recipe was straightforward: biscuit-like dough, dropped into a pot of simmering brown sugar syrup made with butter and water. As the dumplings cooked, they absorbed the caramel-like sauce, turning soft on the inside with a sticky, sugary coating on the outside. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. Served warm, sometimes with cream or a scoop of ice cream, it was the kind of dessert that wrapped you in a hug. Brown sugar dumplings became popular during the Great Depression and wartime years, when families had to make do with what was on hand. Sugar, flour, and butter were staples, and this recipe stretched those ingredients into something that felt indulgent, even when times were lean. It was the perfect example of thrift meeting creativity, turning a few pantry basics into a dish that could bring smiles around the table. Culturally, this dessert carried the flavor of tradition. Mothers taught it to daughters, grandmothers served it at Sunday suppers, and children remembered the smell of brown sugar bubbling on the stove long after they'd grown up. It was a dish tied to family gatherings, farm kitchens, and the kind of evenings when nothing mattered more than a warm meal together. Over time, as desserts became more elaborate and store-bought sweets replaced homemade ones, brown sugar dumplings slipped quietly into obscurity. Yet for those who tasted them, they remain unforgettable, a humble reminder that sweetness often comes from the simplest things. If you've ever heard someone call oatmeal pie the poor man's pecan pie, they weren't exaggerating. This humble dessert became a staple in American kitchens during the lean years of the late 19th century and through the Great Depression, when pecans were too expensive for most families. Instead, oats stepped in, not just as a filler, but as the star of the show. The recipe was a simple blend of rolled oats, sugar, butter, eggs, and corn syrup or molasses, baked into a flaky pie crust. The oats created a chewy, almost nutty texture that mimicked the feel of pecans, while the sugary filling baked into a rich caramel-like custard. The result was hearty, sweet, and surprisingly satisfying. No one missed the nuts when each bite carried both chew and sweetness. What made oatmeal pie special wasn't only its taste, but its symbolism. It represented survival and creativity, proof that even in hard times, families could make something that felt like a treat. On farm tables across the Midwest and South, this pie was served with pride, often at church suppers, holidays, or Sunday dinners. It reminded everyone that dessert didn't require extravagance, only ingenuity. Children grew up loving its sticky filling, while adults appreciated that it could be made with pantry staples they already had on hand. For many, the first bite was a reminder that you didn't need pecans, or much money, for something to feel special. Over time, as pecans became more accessible and store-bought pies filled bakery shelves, oatmeal pie faded from the spotlight. Yet those who remember it know it wasn't just an imitation. It was its own dessert, warm, rustic, and rooted in resilience. Because sometimes, what begins as a substitute becomes a tradition all its own. At first, it sounds like a mistake, mayonnaise in a chocolate cake. But for decades, this recipe was a quiet hero of American kitchens, proving that resourcefulness could create something rich and indulgent from the humblest of ingredients. Mayonnaise chocolate cake wasn't just clever, it was delicious. The idea began during the Great Depression and gained popularity during World War II, when rationing made butter, milk, and eggs harder to come by. Mayonnaise, made from oil and eggs, became the perfect substitute. Mixed into chocolate batter, it created a cake that was moist, tender, and surprisingly decadent. The mayo didn't taste like mayo, it simply melted into the background, giving the cake its signature softness. For families stretched thin, this cake felt like a luxury. You didn't need fancy frostings or layers, it stood tall on its own, often dusted with powdered sugar or topped with a simple glaze. Kids loved it because it tasted rich and fudgy, while adults loved it because it could be baked from pantry staples already on hand. By the 1940s and 50s, food companies caught on, and mayonnaise brands even printed the recipe on their jars, encouraging homemakers to give it a try. And they did, over and over again. The cake became a trusted favorite at birthdays, potlucks, and family dinners. But like many clever recipes born from necessity, it eventually fell out of fashion. As butter and eggs became readily available again, home bakers moved back to traditional cakes. Mayonnaise chocolate cake, once a shining example of creativity, became a quirky memory tucked into vintage cookbooks. Still, for those who grew up with it, a single bite takes you back, reminding us that sometimes, the strangest ideas end up tasting the sweetest.